Hello and welcome to Hindu newspaper analysis. Today in the editorial page there is an article about urban employment as the focal point. It talks about the urban employment which has taken a beating in the past 6 months, particularly because the major sectors like construction and others which used to provide maximum employment have now shrunk, and because there is no demand for housing sector, and say various other sectors in the economy have also registering a negative growth. The employment took a beating, and there is what we call a great unemployment accreting to the workers in urban areas. A particular term which is being used in this article is the vulnerable employment. You see, in urban areas, vulnerable employment is a major cause. So, how do we define vulnerable employment? Vulnerable employment is characterized by inadequate earnings, low productivity, difficult conditions of work that undermine the basic rights of workers, because there is no job guarantee, and the working conditions are also appalling in the urban areas, and they do not have any rights to represent their own difficulties, and there is no organized trade union kind of thing which can represent their grievances. So the maximum hit is being taken by the urban workers, who are also termed as vulnerable because of the characterization of their low incomes, and their inability to protect their own interests in the urban areas. So basically, the sectors that have shrunk in the past 6 months are the uh, construction has gone down by 50%, trade, hotels, and other services 47% negative growth. This is a negative growth. Manufacturing minus 39%, mining minus 23%. Those that create the maximum new jobs in the economy. In a scenario where each of these sectors is contracting so sharply, it will lead to either a growing number of people losing jobs or falling to get one or even both, failing to get even one or even both. That is, there is a possibility of a decline in employment and a subsequent rise in unemployment. See, the authors note that there is a possibility of a decline in employment and a subsequent rise in unemployment. This sharp contraction has to be seen in the light of India having witnessed a wave of massive reverse migration during the early phase of the lockdown, with millions of workers returning to their home states due to loss of livelihoods. As the coronavirus pandemic started beginning right from March 23rd onwards, particularly in the first and second weeks of April, we have seen lakhs of people walking back to their native places in search of what we call running away from these urban areas to their native places. So this has caused a lot of what we call loss of availability of manpower to the urban industries. It's doubtful as to when and whether they would return to their places of work, and it would not be unreasonable to assume that a majority of workers might not go back in the near future. This appears to be a possibility because in the rural areas, these migrant workers who have come back are now finding out local employment, or maybe they are going back to agriculture operations, or sometimes they are what we call looking for remunerative employment in other cities rather than going back to the same city from which they have come back. So they are now looking at going to other cities in search of employment. The abrupt announcement of the lockdown exposed the severe vulnerabilities of urban low-end informal jobs, as the share of vulnerable employment is higher in India than that of the world or Southeast Asia region. If you look at the statistics given by International Labour Organization, of the 535 million labor force, that is 53 crores labor force in India in 2019, some 39.86 crores have poor quality jobs. They are vulnerable employees. Poor quality of jobs and high informality are key for the high level of working poors, or those living in incomes of less than 198 rupees per day. The poor quality of jobs, authors note, and the high informality are key for the high level of working poors or those living on incomes of less than 198 rupees in a day. Thus, despite higher economic growth in recent years, working poverty in India also remains high. Despite higher economic growth in recent years, working poverty in India also remains high. Given the contraction and back of demand in the economy, it's quite plausible that there would be a significant dip in urban employment generation. There could be a significant dip in urban employment generation. Thus, there are two challenges policy interventions in securing the livelihoods of workers in urban areas have to address. So, policy interventions have to be first to generate more jobs. First is to generate more jobs, and second to reduce vulnerabilities by providing decent wages and some form of job security. So, first is uh, generating more jobs, and second is this vulnerable employees that should be reduced because a decent wages have to be paid to them and job security must be provided to urban poor. So the situation in India according to authors with respect to urban employment is high and persistent instance of vulnerable employment are a reflection of nature of structural transformation process. So high vulnerable employment are a reflection, they say it is a reflection of nature of the structural transformational process whereby capital and labor transfer from low to higher value added sectors, where the transformings of factors of production like labor and capital, they have to move from low to higher value added sector. India presents a curious case in this regard as capital and labor are moving from low value added activities in a sector to another sector but not to higher value added activities. This is the problem in India. The two major factors of production like the labor and capital, instead of moving from low value added jobs or low value added sectors to higher value added sectors, in India curiously the situation is they are moving from lower value added sectors from one lower value added sector to another sector horizontally but not to higher value added activities. This leads to a situation where large proportion of the jobs being created is of poor quality because of capital movement, because of capital and labor movement into insignificant sectors or low value sectors. uh, Large portion of the jobs being created as a poor quality jobs. So jobs created are very poor quality and is expected to remain so. The service sector led growth in recent years had intensified this as there is coexistence of strong job creation in some information and communication technology ICT intensive services, along with a significant portion of the jobs being created in traditional low value added services where informality and vulnerable forms of employment are dominant. The outcome of such a process is high incidence of informality, which continues to undermine the prospects of reducing working poverty. Which continues to undermine the prospects of reducing working poverty. The pandemic and associated policy responses have exposed the vulnerability of these urban jobs. So the pandemic had exposed the vulnerability of these urban jobs. So what steps need to be taken? The author presents a few steps like given the scale of urbanization, the focus on urban employment generation programs should be in coordination with local governments. This is to this is the key to solving other problems faced by in cities. As these problems are daunting, actors at the local level need to have more resources at their disposal. Resource mobilization could be enabled by formation of local alliances involving elected representatives, trade unions, entrepreneurs, community groups, etc. So basically, it asks for focus on urban employment generation program should be in coordination with local governments. So they have to involve all the local governments, local MLAs, local people, mm, forming local alliances, involving elected representatives, trade unions, entrepreneurs, community groups, etc. Second, a major local initiative would be to design and implement employment intensive investment policies. employment intensive investment policies. These policies should embrace initiatives of both private entrepreneurs as well as the government. Private investments need to be facilitated by conducive constructional relations, conducive contractual relations between labor and capital. Enterprise formation needs to be an integral part of the strategy. Converging interests for workers and entrepreneurs on issues related to technology, productivity enhancement. Small and micro enterprises, the fulcrum of industrialization, need extra support to balance the interest between labor and capital, as neither have collective bargaining powers. The third element would be to prioritize urban infrastructure as it accounts for a large share of total investments in the local economy. So the authors stress that local initiative would be to design and implement employment intensive investment policies. So employment intensive investment policies, that should be the focus area. These policies should embrace the initiatives of both private entrepreneurship as well as the government. So both private and government investment should be entertained in generating employment. Private investments need to be facilitated by conducive contractual relations between labor and capital. So, conducive contractual relationship between labor and capital must be ensured to obtain private capital. Converging interests for workers or entrepreneurs on issues related to technology and productivity enhancement. Small and micro enterprises, fulcrum of industrialization. So the fulcrum of industrialization, the base or the balance of the economy is the MSME sector. Need extra support to balance. MSME sector needs extra support to balance the interests between labor and capital. Neither have collective bargaining powers. So neither labor nor capital has got collective bargaining powers. Third element would be to prioritize urban infrastructure as it accounts for a large share of total investments in the local economy. So urban infrastructure has to be the thrust area because it is the area where total investments in the local economy are more. Invest in infrastructure. However, much of these investments rarely benefit poor urban dwellings. So these investments that they pour in urban areas, they rarely benefit the poor urban dwellers, as housing, roads, sewerage, water systems are inadequate for their needs. Labor intensive approach to building municipal infrastructure can be a cost effective alternative to capital intensive approach as wage rates are low. So if the municipal areas or municipal corporations want to take up any projects, instead of depending on the capital intensive approach, it is better to depend, or it is better to involve manual labor, so that the manual labor is cheap and people get employment. That's the rationale behind this approach. Labor intensive approach, building municipal infrastructure, can be a cost effective alternative to capital intensive approach as wage rates are low. Infrastructure investments would spur employment. So infrastructure investment would spur employment, generate earnings, contribute to small enterprise formation. So they spur employment, they generate earnings and contribute to small enterprise formation. Construction of low cost housing is another activity that can be carried out using labor intensive methods. Low cost housings. Then while yielding substantial collateral benefits for urban dwellers, is an ILO document establishes. Okay, these are the measures suggested by the International Labour Organization document. Fourth element could be an immediate launch of an urban employment scheme oriented toward building large-scale medical, health and sanitation infrastructure in cities and towns across India. Other immediate employment generations can be to expand networks of essential services as a part of welfare interventions of state and local governments. The capacity of our rural economy to absorb workers who return from cities is low, and the viability of agriculture to provide these workers with a decent living is questionable. In fact, Many of these workers might have left their traditional work in the farm sector because income from agriculture would be insufficient for their survival, obviously. So then, how to employ these rural workers, those people who have migrated back to their villages? Okay, is NREGA is enough? So author suggests that Mahatma Gandhi Employment Guarantee Act or its substitutes can absorb a significant proportion of these workers under the current circumstances. It is not valid to assume that the NREGA could absorb these workers. So it is not, NREGA is quite inadequate to absorb the quantum of labor force available at the rural area. It's important that MGNREGA be expanded by both increasing the budgetary allocations and the guaranteed minimum number of days of work. At the same time, it's very idealistic to conclude entirety of the workforce which has returned to the respective home states will be accommodated by an expanded Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act or by a close substitute. These workers might have chosen not to take up NREGA jobs in the first place and instead opted to migrate and work in other states for higher wages. NREGA and rural job schemes have to be strengthened, their capacity increased, but only a portion of the workforce might be accommodated in it. There will still be a large number of workers who need to be provided with alternative sources of employment. Generating decent urban jobs looks to be the only way out, the authors conclude. So the article focuses on the vulnerable employment and urban workforce getting lower wages, low job security, and the problems created by the contraction of the economy in particularly major sectors like construction, trade, hotels, and other services, manufacturing and mining. And these are the sectors which had created maximum employment, and now those are running in negative growth. So absolutely there is a degrowth in these sectors, leaving out no employment opportunities in these areas. So in infrastructure investment is one area where labor intensive projects must be taken, and the interplay between labor and capital should be such that these two factors of production, the labor and capital, must move from lower sectors to high value added sectors, so that no they could yield more results. So basically the focus should be on the urban employment, or the author concludes urban employment as the focal point. It's a very interesting article. It throws into limelight the problems faced by the urban workers who are now teetering on low incomes or no incomes, as the pandemic crisis had thrown them into a quagmire of problems and difficulties. Thank you.